There is a certain kind of silence that follows losing everything. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind you choose. It is the kind that swallows you whole. The kind that sits in your chest like a stone and refuses to move. Michael Anderson knew that silence well. He had heard it for the first time on a cold Tuesday morning in November, standing outside a building he used to own, with nothing in his coat pocket but a phone that would be disconnected by evening. 6 weeks before that morning, Michael Anderson was the kind of man other men envied from a distance. He was 51 years old. He had built his fortune from the ground up, not inherited, not gifted, but built brick by brick over 2 decades of calculated risk and relentless ambition. He ran a network of pediatric hospitals across 3 states. 7 hospitals. Hundreds of staff. Thousands of children who received care because of facilities he had funded, managed, and expanded. The press called him a visionary. His board called him irreplaceable. His accountant called him every month, with numbers that made ordinary people's eyes go wide. He had a home in Connecticut with 6 bedrooms and a wraparound porch that overlooked a lake. He had a Mercedes and a Range Rover parked in a garage that was larger than most apartments in New York City. He had a personal chef on call 3 days a week. He had accounts at 3 different banks, and he barely knew the exact balances in any of them because it simply had never mattered enough to check. He had, in short, everything. And then, in the space of 43 days, he had nothing. It started the way most catastrophic things start. Quietly. One small irregularity in the financials. One number that didn't quite line up. Michael's chief financial officer, a man named Dennis Hartwell, a man Michael had trusted for 11 years, a man who had stood as a groomsman at Michael's second wedding, had been quietly moving money for over 3 years. Not all at once. Never all at once. Small transfers, hidden behind restructured invoices and falsified vendor accounts. By the time the auditors caught it, Dennis had taken $14 million and disappeared to a country that did not extradite. The lawsuits came within days. The board froze operations. The investors pulled back. The banks called in their loans. And the house on the lake with the wraparound porch, was seized before Michael had time to pack more than 2 suitcases. He told himself it was temporary. That was the first lie he told himself, and he believed it completely. He moved into a budget motel outside of Hartford. The kind with thin walls and a vending machine that kept taking his money without giving anything back. He had $6,300 in a personal account that had not been touched by the legal proceedings, the last of his untangled funds. He had no immediate income, no operational business, and no clear timeline for when any of it would be resolved. He told himself he would be back on his feet in 3 weeks. Maybe 4. He was not back on his feet in 3 weeks. By week 5, the $6,300 was mostly gone. And Michael, a man who had once managed $100 million budgets, could not explain where it went. He had not been reckless. He had not gone on a spending spree. He had simply lived the way he had always lived, just in a smaller space. He ate at diners instead of restaurants. He bought brand-name toiletries out of habit. He kept his phone on the best data plan because downgrading felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. He paid for things with the casual ease of a man who had always had more coming. But nothing was coming. Not anymore. By week 6, he had $212. He was 2 days away from being asked to leave the motel. And when he sat on the edge of that thin mattress and tried to calculate, to plan, to use the same financial instincts that had built a multi-million-dollar enterprise, he found nothing. His mind, trained for large numbers, for percentages and projections and quarterly forecasts, had no framework for this. He did not know how to make $200 last a week. He did not know which needs were truly needs and which were simply habits wearing the costume of necessity. He had spent his entire adult life learning how to grow money. He had never once learned how to protect it when there was almost none left. He walked out of the motel that night with one suitcase. He had paid for one more night but couldn't sleep. The air outside was cold and sharp, the streets half-lit and mostly empty. He walked without a destination because every destination required something he didn't have. He passed a shelter that was already full. He passed a church that was locked. He ended up sitting on a bench near a bus terminal, his suitcase between his feet, watching the city move around him like water around a stone. And that is when the silence found him again. Not the silence of a quiet morning or an empty boardroom. The silence of a man who has run out of answers. The silence of someone who realizes, with a cold and sobering clarity, that everything he thought he knew about money had only ever worked because he already had enough of it to begin with. His strategies, his formulas, his investment philosophies, they were all built on a foundation he had always assumed would be there. Take away the foundation, and the rest was just words. He sat on that bench for a long time. A man walked past him and dropped $1 near his feet, not unkindly, just casually, the way people do when they see someone sitting still in the cold. Michael stared at that $1 for a long moment. He thought about leaving it. He thought about his pride, about what it meant to pick it up, about the version of himself that would have never imagined this moment. Then he picked it up, and he put it in his pocket. And something in him, some last, stubborn wall, came quietly down. He didn't know it yet, but that was the moment the real story began. Not the story of his fall. That part was over. This was the story of what comes next, when a man who knew everything about wealth is forced to learn, for the very first time, how to truly handle money. The bus terminal bench became Michael's classroom for the next several days, though he would not have called it that at the time. At the time, he called it surviving. Just surviving. 1 hour at a time, one decision at a time, in a world that had no patience for men who were still figuring out the rules. He found work on the third day. Not the kind of work he was used to. No boardroom, no conference call, no assistant setting up his schedule. A man named Roy, who ran a small moving company out of a beat-up white truck, needed an extra body for the week. Heavy lifting, long hours, $7 above minimum wage, paid at the end of each day in cash. Michael said yes before Roy finished the sentence. That first day, he moved furniture for 9 hours. He carried boxes up 4 flights of stairs in a building with no elevator. He wrapped mirrors in moving blankets and loaded a truck in the rain. By the time Roy handed him the cash that evening, Michael's back ached in places he didn't know could ache, and his hands, the hands that had once signed contracts worth millions, had small blisters forming at the base of each finger. He stood on the sidewalk and counted the bills. $89. He stared at it for a moment. Then, without fully knowing why, he went to a nearby convenience store and bought a small notebook and a pen. It cost him $2.14. He almost put it back. Then he didn't. That night, sitting in a shelter that had opened up a bed for him, he opened the notebook to the first page and wrote the number at the top. $89. Then he sat there and thought about what came next. He had no system. He had no plan. He had spent the last 3 weeks bleeding money he didn't understand, making small purchases that felt harmless in the moment and then looking up to find himself with almost nothing. He was not going to do that again. But he didn't know what to do instead. That was the honest truth. He didn't know. The answer came from the last place he expected. 2 days later, Michael was eating a meal at a community food table set up near the shelter, a long folding table with donated food served by volunteers every evening. He sat across from a woman named Gloria. She looked to be in her mid-60s. She wore a wool coat that was clean but old, and she had a small canvas bag that she kept close to her side. She was talking to the woman next to her, and Michael wasn't listening, not really, until he heard her say something that pulled his attention like a hand on his shoulder. She was explaining very calmly, very practically, how she divided every dollar she made. She cleaned offices 3 mornings a week. She also helped a neighbor with laundry and errands for a small weekly payment. Whatever came in, she said, she split into 3 parts. She held up her hand as she talked, counting on her fingers. Half of everything goes to what you need to live. Your shelter, your food, your transportation, the things without which you cannot function. Then 30 cents out of every dollar goes toward the small things that make life bearable. A cup of coffee that you actually enjoy, a phone call to someone you love, something small that reminds you that you are still a human being and not just a problem to be solved. And the last 20 cents, she tapped her ring finger firmly as she said this, the last 20 cents you do not touch. You protect it. You save it. You let it sit until it becomes something. The woman next to her nodded like she had heard this before. Michael sat very still. 50% for needs. 30% for small wants. 20% saved, protected, untouched. He recognized it. Somewhere in the back of his financial memory, he had heard of this framework, the 50-30-20 rule. He had seen it mentioned in personal finance articles that he had never bothered to read completely because they were written, he had always assumed, for people who needed that kind of basic guidance. Not for men like him. Not for investors and executives who operated at an entirely different level. Sitting at that folding table with a plate of donated food in front of him, Michael Anderson understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he had always been wrong about that. He went back to his notebook that night and started over. He drew 3 columns on the page. His wants. Savings. He wrote $89 at the top, his first day's pay, and he split it. $44.50 for needs. $26.70 for wants. $17.80 for savings. He stared at the numbers. $17.80 saved from a single day's work. It felt almost laughable. A man who had once moved millions of dollars between accounts was celebrating $17 in savings. But he didn't laugh. He wrote it down and he circled it. The next day he went back to Roy's truck. And the day after that. And when Roy paid him at the end of each day, Michael went to his notebook before he spent a single cent and he divided the money into his 3 columns. He kept the savings in a separate small envelope tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his chest, where he could feel it. He tracked every purchase in the want and need columns. The bus fare to eat. A slightly better meal when he had the option, want. He learned quickly that the line between those 2 categories was thinner and more dishonest than he had ever imagined. So many things he had always called needs were simply wants he had never questioned. He started questioning everything. A week passed. Then another. He made mistakes. On a Thursday evening, tired and cold after a long shift, he stopped at a diner and ordered more food than he needed, simply because he was exhausted and the warmth of the place felt like medicine. He overspent his want column by $11. He wrote it down anyway. He didn't hide it from himself. He looked at the number and accepted it, and the next day he adjusted. That was new for him. He had spent his professional life having other people absorb his overruns. Now there was no one else. Just the notebook and the truth. But there were harder lessons than overspending at a diner. One night, 3 weeks into his new system, someone went through his bag while he slept. The savings envelope was gone. $31. Almost 2 weeks of careful, disciplined accumulation, gone in a single night. Michael sat with that loss the next morning and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief but lived somewhere between the two. He thought about giving up the system. He thought about what the point was. He thought, briefly and darkly, about all the ways the world seemed designed to keep certain people exactly where they were. Then he thought about Gloria. He thought about the way she had held up her hand and counted on her fingers with complete conviction, as though the system wasn't a theory for her but simply the way the world worked. He thought about the fact that she had probably faced losses like this before. Probably worse. And she was still there, still dividing, still protecting that 20% with everything she had. Michael opened his notebook. He wrote $31 on a new line. He put a small dash next to it and wrote the word stolen. Then he turned to a fresh column and started again. He did not skip a single day. By the end of the month, he had rebuilt his savings to $44. He had a rough weekly routine. He had a shelter bed most nights and knew which community kitchens served the most consistent meals and on which days. He had blisters that were turning into calluses. He had stopped buying the brand-name toiletries. He had stopped doing a lot of things that had once felt essential and discovered that essential was a much smaller category than he had ever known. And he had something else, something harder to measure but more valuable than the $44 in his envelope. He had clarity. For the first time in his adult life, he could look at any amount of money, any amount at all, and know exactly what it was for. He could hold a $10 bill and make a real decision about it. Not a careless one. Not a habitual one. A real one. He was not comfortable. He was not recovered. He was not anywhere close to the life he had lost. But he was not bleeding anymore. And after weeks of watching money disappear without understanding why, that felt like the first solid ground he had touched in a very long time. He was sitting outside the shelter one evening, notebook in his lap, when a younger man sat down nearby. The man's name was Jackson. He was 28 years old, recently laid off from a warehouse job, sleeping rough for the first time in his life and completely overwhelmed by it. He looked the way Michael had looked 6 weeks ago, lost in a way that had nothing to do with not knowing the neighborhood. Jackson looked at the notebook and asked what Michael was writing. Michael looked at him for a moment. Then he turned to a fresh page and drew 3 columns. Jackson was not an easy student. That much was clear from the very first conversation. He was the kind of young man who had grown up watching money disappear and had simply accepted that as the natural order of things. Not because he was careless or foolish, but because no one had ever shown him anything different. His mother had worked 2 jobs his entire childhood and still struggled every month. His father had been absent long enough that Jackson had stopped counting the years. The financial lessons of his upbringing were simple and unspoken. Money comes in, money goes out, and somewhere in the middle you try to eat and keep the lights on. The idea that there was a system, a structure, a deliberate way of managing even the smallest amount, that was genuinely new information for him. Michael explained the 3 columns. Jackson listened with the slightly skeptical expression of someone who suspects he is being told something too simple to actually work. "That's it," Jackson said. "You just divide it up?" "That's it," Michael said. "But the dividing is harder than it sounds. Because you have to be honest about which column something belongs in. And most people have never been honest about that in their entire lives." Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I spent $12 yesterday on scratch tickets." Michael nodded. "Which columns?" Jackson thought about it. Want, Michael confirmed. "Write it down. Don't judge it yet. Just write it down and look at it." That was how it started between them. Not a formal arrangement. Not a plan. Just 2 men on a shelter bench, one with a notebook and one with a growing curiosity, talking about money in a way that neither of them had ever talked about it before. Michael because he had always considered it beneath him. Jackson because no one had ever offered. Within a week, Jackson had his own notebook. Within 2 weeks, he had started working with Michael at Roy's moving company, which had picked up enough business in the early winter months to keep both of them busy most days. They fell into a natural rhythm, work together during the day, review the notebooks in the evening, talk through the decisions they had made and the ones they had avoided. It was accountability in its most stripped-down form. No app, no financial advisor, no automated savings transfer. Just 2 people watching each other's columns and asking honest questions. Jackson was faster at the discipline than Michael had expected. Once he accepted the framework, he held to it with the kind of stubbornness that comes from having very little margin for error. He had grown up tight. He understood scarcity in his bones. What he had never had was a way to transform that scarcity into something intentional. The 3 columns gave him that. Within 3 weeks, his savings envelope held $62, more money than he had ever set aside at one time in his life. Momentum that felt, against all reasonable evidence, like the beginning of something. It was Jackson who said it first. "We could sell things," he said. He was looking at a group of street vendors across the road, men with carts and folding tables selling food and small goods to the evening crowd. Hot food. People always buy hot food when it's cold. Michael looked at the vendors. He looked at his notebook. He thought about it the way he used to think about business proposals, not with excitement first, but with structure. What would it cost? What could it realistically earn? What were the risks? What was the minimum viable starting point? The math was not impressive by any standard he had previously used. But it was real math with real numbers, and it pointed toward a real possibility. They spent 4 days researching, asking vendors about their costs, watching which items sold fastest, calculating what a basic setup would require. A used handcart in decent condition ran between $40 and $70 at second-hand equipment shops. Basic supplies for hot drinks and simple food could be sourced cheaply from a wholesale supplier that Jackson knew from his warehouse days. They needed a permit, which required a small fee, and a fixed address, which was the first real wall they hit. A fixed address. Neither of them had one. Michael sat with that problem for 2 days. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He went back to the community food table where he had first heard Gloria speak, and he found her, and he explained the situation. He asked if she knew anyone who might allow them to use an address temporarily for permit purposes, in exchange for a share of whatever the venture produced. Gloria looked at him for a long moment. She had the eyes of someone who had learned to evaluate people quickly and accurately, because the cost of being wrong was too high. "You've got the notebook still?" she asked. He showed her. She looked at the columns, at the careful daily entries, at the savings total circled at the bottom of each week's page. She gave them the address of a friend who ran a small laundromat nearby. The friend, a quiet woman named Mrs. Park, asked for 10% of weekly revenue in exchange. Michael and Jackson agreed immediately. It was fair. More than fair. It was a door opening where there had been a wall. They pooled their savings. $150 combined. They bought a second-hand handcart for $45, a small propane setup for $30, and initial supplies for $40. That left $35 as a reserve, their emergency fund, which Michael insisted they not touch under any circumstances. He had learned that lesson the hard way in that motel room where the $6,300 had simply evaporated, spent in comfortable ignorance. A reserve was not optional. A reserve was the difference between a setback and a complete collapse. The first day they set up, they made $22. It was cold. The propane took 3 attempts to light. Jackson burned his hand on the first batch of water and spent the afternoon working with a dish towel wrapped around his palm. They ran out of cups an hour earlier than expected because Michael had underestimated demand. One man complained about the coffee being too weak. A city inspector walked past and spent 5 long minutes examining their permit and equipment while both of them stood very still and tried to look like they had always known exactly what they were doing. $22. They divided it immediately, right there on the street, notebook open on top of the cart. $11 to operating needs and resupply. $6.60 to the want column, small but protected. $4.40 to savings. $4.40 saved from their first day of business. Michael wrote it down and circled it. Jackson watched him do it and shook his head slowly, not in discouragement but in something closer to wonder. "You really believe this works?" Jackson said. It was not quite a question. I believe it's the only thing that works, Michael said. Everything else I tried was bigger and it all fell apart. This is small enough to control. And control is where everything starts. The second day they made $31. The third day, $38. By the end of the first week they had cleared just over $190 in revenue, paid Mrs. Parker 10%, covered their resupply costs, and added $22 to their combined savings. $22. And yet Michael felt something that night that he had not felt since before the collapse. Not satisfaction exactly. Something quieter and more durable than satisfaction. He felt like a man who understood what he was doing and why. He felt like someone who could look at a small number and see a larger truth inside it, that discipline applied consistently, even at the smallest scale, generates its own kind of momentum. It doesn't feel like momentum at first. It feels like almost nothing. But it is not nothing. It is foundation. The weeks that followed were not smooth. Nothing about this life was smooth. There was a stretch of 4 days in December when the temperature dropped so severely that standing outside was not viable and they lost nearly a week's worth of potential revenue. There was a morning when their propane supplier raised prices without warning and they had to spend an afternoon recalculating their entire cost structure. There was a difficult conversation with a man who had been sleeping near their usual spot for months and felt, with some justification, that their cart was disrupting the small economy of that corner. They listened to him. They adjusted their position by half a block. They offered him a hot drink. Small problems, handled with the same deliberate attention they gave to their columns. That was the discipline. Not the big gestures. The small, daily, unglamorous practice of paying attention. By the 6th week, they had saved enough to rent a room. A single room in a boarding house 3 blocks from Mrs. Park's laundromat. Shared bathroom, 1 window, a radiator that made a sound like an old argument every time it came on. 2 cots. 1 small table where they kept their notebooks and counted the day's earnings each evening before anything else. The night they moved in, Jackson sat on the edge of his cot and looked around the room. It was not much. By almost any standard, it was very little. But it had a door that locked and a roof that held and a radiator that argued through the night and kept them warm. 6 weeks ago I didn't have this, Jackson said quietly. Michael looked at his notebook. At the columns. At the small, steady numbers that had built this room one decision at a time. Neither did I, he said. And I used to have a house on a lake. They were both quiet for a moment, each in their own version of that thought. Then Michael opened the notebook to a fresh page. Tomorrow we figure out how to get a second cart, he said. Jackson picked up his own notebook. And they got to work. The second cart changed everything. Not overnight. Not dramatically. But in the quiet, compounding way that real change always moves. Slowly at first, then steadily, then in a direction you can finally see clearly from a distance. They hired their first helper in January. A teenager named Marcus who lived 2 streets over and needed weekend work badly enough to show up on time and ask good questions. Michael taught him the columns on his first day. Not as a condition of employment, but because he had come to believe, with the kind of conviction that only comes from lived experience, that the single most useful thing one person can give another is a framework for handling whatever they have. Marcus listened the way young people listen when they sense that something real is being offered, carefully, a little skeptically, but with genuine attention underneath. By February, the cart operation had grown to a point where Michael and Jackson needed to make a real decision. They could stay where they were, manageable, predictable, safe in the small way that familiar things feel safe. Or they could take the next step. A small commercial kitchen rental. A proper food handler's license. A move from the street corner to something with 4 walls and a regular customer base. The savings were there. Not comfortably, not with any margin for error, but there. 11 weeks of disciplined division had built a reserve that made the next step mathematically possible. Michael ran the numbers 4 times. He showed Jackson. He showed Mrs. Park, who had become something of an informal advisor to them both, the kind of practical wisdom in her eyes that only comes from years of making things work with less than you need. Mrs. Park looked at the numbers and said, simply, "The math is right. The question is whether your discipline will hold when the stakes get bigger." Michael thought about Dennis Hartwell. He thought about 11 years of misplaced trust and the 43 days it took to lose everything that trust had helped build. He thought about all the ways he had once managed enormous sums with enormous carelessness, assuming that the abundance would simply continue because it always had. "The discipline holds," he said, "because now I understand why it matters." They signed the kitchen rental agreement on a Wednesday morning. It was a modest space, a shared commercial kitchen used by 3 other small food vendors on rotating schedules. Their slot was early mornings and weekend afternoons. They expanded their menu slightly, enough to attract a small but consistent base of regulars from the neighborhood. A construction crew that started their day nearby became loyal morning customers. A group of office workers 2 blocks over discovered their lunch offerings and started coming back weekly. Marcus brought in 2 friends who needed work. Michael hired one of them, a young woman named Destiny who turned out to have a natural instinct for customer interaction that neither Michael nor Jackson could match. She remembered names. She remembered orders. She made people feel like regulars from the second visit, which meant they became regulars. Michael gave her a notebook on her first week and taught her the 3 columns. She looked at him with the same slightly skeptical expression Jackson had worn 4 months earlier. 3 weeks later, she showed Michael her savings envelope with quiet pride. $40. Her first $40 ever set aside with intention. Michael felt something move in his chest when he looked at that envelope. Something he recognized from his previous life but had forgotten the texture of. The feeling of having built something that mattered beyond the numbers. He had built hospitals. He had funded pediatric care for thousands of children. And standing in a small shared kitchen watching a 23-year-old woman hold up $40 she had saved for the first time in her life, he felt the same thing. The scale was different. The feeling was identical. That was the moment he understood something he would spend the rest of his life trying to articulate. Wealth had never been the number. It had always been the understanding. Spring came slowly and then all at once, the way it does in the Northeast, gray and reluctant for weeks and then suddenly, one morning, warm and open and full of possibility. Michael sat outside the kitchen on a Tuesday morning before the first customers arrived, his notebook in his lap, and he did something he had not done in months. He looked back. Not with grief, not with the kind of backward glance that pulls you under, but with the clear eyes of someone who has walked a long road and can now see the whole shape of it. He thought about the Connecticut house, about the lake and the wraparound porch and the Sunday mornings when he would stand with his coffee and feel like a man who had figured something out. He had been wrong about what he had figured out. He had figured out how to accumulate. He had never figured out how to truly understand. Those are not the same thing. They look the same from the outside when the numbers are big enough. But they are entirely different foundations, and one of them holds in a storm and one of them does not. He thought about Dennis Hartwell. He had carried anger about Dennis for a long time, a hard, heavy anger that had served as fuel in the worst weeks when there was nothing else to run on. But sitting in the spring morning with a functioning small business and a notebook full of deliberate decisions, the anger had gone quiet. Not because what Dennis did was forgivable in any simple sense, but because Michael had come to understand that what Dennis had done, in a strange and brutal way, had given him something no success ever had. It had given him the floor. The actual floor, stripped of everything, where the only question was what you do with what remains. And the answer to that question, Michael now knew with absolute certainty, Was everything? The answer to that question was your entire life. He had lost $14 million to a man he trusted. He had gained something that $14 million had never been able to buy him. He was not grateful for the betrayal, but he was no longer destroyed by it. Jackson knocked on the door of the kitchen and leaned out. Marcus is here. Destiny's on her way. You ready? Michael closed the notebook. Yeah, he said. Let's go. The business was not large. Let that be clear. It was not a comeback story in the Hollywood sense. No dramatic return to his former scale, no triumphant boardroom moment, no profile in a business magazine. The operation employed 4 people including Michael and Jackson. It had a modest but reliable weekly revenue. It had 3 columns in a notebook that were reviewed every single evening without exception. It had a savings account at a local credit union, a real account now, not an envelope, that grew slowly but never shrank because they never spent from it without a plan and a reason and a conversation between all parties involved. It had discipline. Daily, unglamorous, unrelenting discipline. The kind that does not make headlines but builds lives. In April, a social worker named Patricia who ran a financial literacy program at a community center 2 miles away reached out. Someone had told her about Michael, about the notebook, about the 3 columns, about the small business that had grown from a pooled savings of $150. She asked if he would be willing to come and speak to a group of adults in her program. People in transition, she said. People trying to rebuild. Michael said yes immediately. He stood in front of 17 people in a community center meeting room on a Thursday evening. Folding chairs. Fluorescent lights. A whiteboard behind him with a marker that barely worked. He looked at the faces in that room and recognized every single one of them, not personally, but in the specific and particular way that you recognize people who are carrying the weight you once carried. The particular exhaustion of someone who is trying very hard with very little and cannot quite see the path forward. He did not tell them about the hospitals. He did not tell them about the Connecticut house or the Mercedes or the investment portfolio. He told them about the bench at the bus terminal. He told them about Gloria and the folding table and the 3 columns she counted on her fingers. He told them about the stolen envelope and starting over. He told them about Marcus and Destiny and a $40 savings envelope held up with quiet pride. He drew 3 columns on the whiteboard with the barely working marker. Once. Savings. 50%. 30%. 20%. He told them that the numbers were not magic. He told them that the discipline was not easy. He told them that there would be days when the system felt pointless and the progress felt invisible and the temptation to simply spend what you have because at least that feels like something, that temptation would be real and loud and completely understandable. He told them to write it down anyway. He told them that the notebook is not about the money. The notebook is about attention. About the radical, countercultural act of paying close attention to where your resources go every single day without looking away. Because looking away is what the world teaches you to do. Every advertisement, every impulse, every convenient distraction is designed to pull your attention away from the simple truth of your own numbers. The notebook pulls it back. The 3 columns pull it back. And when your attention is on your own numbers, really on them, honestly and consistently, that is when you begin to have power over your own life. Real power. Not the kind that comes from a balance sheet. The kind that comes from understanding. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then a woman in the 3rd row raised her hand. She was perhaps 40 years old, working 2 part-time jobs, trying to save enough to move her family out of a housing situation that was no longer safe. She had been listening with her arms crossed, the way people listen when they want to believe something but are protecting themselves from disappointment. What if you do everything right, she said, and it's still not enough? What if the 20% just never gets big enough to matter? Michael looked at her for a long moment. Then you're still better off than you were, he said. Because you're not bleeding anymore. And when you're not bleeding anymore, you can think clearly. And when you can think clearly, you start to see opportunities you couldn't see before. The 20% isn't the destination. It's the proof to yourself that you can be trusted with what you have. And once you trust yourself, once you prove to yourself that you are someone who protects what they've earned, that changes the way you make every other decision. That changes everything. She uncrossed her arms. Michael walked home from the community center that evening along streets he had once walked with nothing. Same streets. Different man. Not because his bank account had recovered to anything close to what it once was. Not because the legal proceedings had resolved or the name Michael Anderson had been restored to any headline. Different because of what he carried now. What he understood. He had built his first fortune on the assumption that he was exceptional. That his intelligence and his vision and his ambition were enough to protect him from the ordinary vulnerabilities that affected ordinary people. He had been wrong. The most sophisticated financial mind in any room is useless without the most basic financial habit at its core, the simple, daily, honest practice of knowing what you have, deciding what it's for, and protecting the part that builds your future. 50% for what you need to live. 30% for what makes you human. 20% for the person you are becoming. He had learned that from a woman at a folding table who earned less in a month than he used to spend on a single dinner. He had learned it on a shelter bench with a $2 notebook. He had learned it through stolen envelopes and burned hands and a radiator that argued through cold nights and a teenager named Marcus holding his first notebook like it might actually matter. It did matter. That was the truth he carried now, and the truth he would spend the rest of his life giving away to anyone willing to sit still long enough to hear it. Real wealth is not what you have. It is what you understand about what you have. It is the daily discipline of small decisions made with full attention and complete honesty. It is the $20 saved on a $90 day when everything in you wants to spend it. It is the notebook open every evening without exception. It is the 3 columns that hold, not because the numbers are impressive, but because the habit is unbreakable. Michael Anderson had been a millionaire. He had lost everything. He had sat on a cold bench with $1 that someone dropped near his feet, and he had made a choice about who he was going to be. He chose discipline. He chose attention. He chose the notebook. And that, more than any investment, any contract, any balance in any account he had ever held, was the wisest financial decision he ever made.